All right, let's dive into this fashion controversy that really got people talking,
Okay.
about Burberry and that whole hoodie thing, the one with the noose. It's a luxury brand making, well, a pretty big mistake. We've got all the research here, so we're going to figure out how this even happened and what this whole thing says about the fashion world in general.
Yeah, it's kind of wild, right? Like you'd think with all the eyes on a like Burberry, especially at London Fashion Week, someone somewhere would got that, right? Before it went out there?
Exactly. It was their autumn-winter 2019 collection, and they called it, get this, Tempest, which now, looking back, feels a little ironic, right? Because a storm definitely brewed. But not the kind they were probably hoping for, huh? And the thing is, one of the models, Liz Kennedy, she actually spoke up about the design before it even made it onto the runway.
Yeah, that's right. Liz Kennedy, she posted later on Instagram that she tried to say something, voice her concerns, but they basically just ignored her. Can you imagine that? Being told to write a letter when you're trying to point out something so, I don't know, so obviously messed up.
It's unbelievable. And then on top of that, you have some of the staff supposedly joking around and pretending to hang the hoodie from the ceiling before the show even started. I mean, how do you even process that level of, I don't know, insensitivity?
It really makes you wonder about like the whole creative process at Burberry.
Mm,
You know what I mean?
yeah.
Was there any thought given to what a noose,
Yeah.
like what it represents, especially thinking about the history?
Yeah, and we're not talking about some random symbol here, right?
Yeah.
The noose is very clearly linked to lynching and racial violence.
Wow.
It's not something to be messed with, let alone turned into some fashion statement, you know what I mean?
Absolutely. The imagery is so jarring. And the fact that it got past so many people, it's pretty alarming.
No.
Burberry, they did apologize and they took the hoodie out of the collection
Mm-hmm.
and removed all the pictures of it. But was that really enough?
Well, Marco Gabbetti, who was the CEO back then, and Riccardo Tisci, the chief creative officer, they both put out public apologies saying they messed up. Gabbetti even said he called Kennedy himself to apologize. But it's just saying, sorry, is that enough to fix this kind of damage?
That's a tough one. The UK's Mental Health Foundation, they pointed out something important, arguing that this whole thing showed a much bigger problem. They talked about the lack of diversity and real consideration in a lot of creative processes, especially in the fashion world.
And that brings us right back to what Kennedy went through, right? Being ignored when you try to say something important, something that matters. That says a lot about who has the power in those situations.
And here's where things get really interesting. If you look a little deeper, you start to see a pattern in the fashion industry, you know? Burberry isn't the only brand that's been called out for being tone deaf with their designs or their campaigns.
So this wasn't like a one-time oops, more like part of a bigger problem.
Exactly. And the question is, how do we go beyond just apologies and actually stop this from happening over and over again?
Right, because saying sorry after the fact, it's kind of like putting a Band-Aid on a much deeper wound, right?
What needs to change, like fundamentally, to make the fashion industry more inclusive and sensitive?
That's what we need to figure out. What's interesting is that this whole incident, it started a bigger conversation about mental health in the fashion industry, which is known for, well, a lot of pressure and often really unrealistic standards of beauty.
Yeah, and it's not just the models, right? It's everyone involved. Designers, stylists, photographers, the whole team. How do we create a healthier environment where people feel safe to speak up and where mental well-being is actually prioritized? That's a conversation we need to have. Think about this. London Fashion Week, it's crazy busy, right? So how do these collections, how do they get developed and approved in the middle of all that chaos? What were the checks and balances that, that missed this?
That's a great point. What kind of systems are in place at these big fashion houses? You'd think with so much at stake, they'd have like a really strict process for checking out the designs before they go public.
Well, it's not as simple as you might think. Fashion, by its very nature, it's about pushing boundaries and going against the grain. But where's the line between creative expression and just being insensitive?
And who decides where that line is? Because clearly in this case, something went very, very wrong.
It seems like there needs to be more different kinds of voices
Yeah.
at the table when decisions are being made, not just to avoid bad press, but to really build a more inclusive and ethical way of designing.
That makes sense. Having different perspectives can help catch potential problems before they, before they blow up. But it's also about creating a culture where people feel comfortable speaking up, like Kennedy tried to do.
Absolutely. It's about making sure people feel safe to share their concerns so that those concerns are actually addressed, not just dismissed. And that means a big shift in how power works in the industry.
So it's more than just adding a few diverse faces to the mix, right? It's about creating a space where everyone feels like they can share their ideas and their perspectives.
Exactly. It's about moving away from this top-down structure and building something that's more collaborative and inclusive.
Now, bringing this back to you, the listener, have you ever been in a situation where you felt like your voice wasn't being heard, especially when it came to something that felt, I don't know, ethically questionable? Did you speak up? What happened?
It's something to think about, right? Because we all have a responsibility to speak up against injustice and to push for positive change, no matter what field we're in.
Okay, so let's take a step back for a second. Think about the theme of Burberry's collection, Tempest. What were the designers trying to say with this theme, and how did that Noose imagery fit in?
It's interesting because the collection, it was inspired by like nautical stuff with ropes and stuff appearing throughout. But
Yeah.
somewhere along the way, they totally missed like the heavy symbolism of a noose.
You'd think someone at some point would have said, hey, maybe this isn't such a good idea. But it seems like that kind of critical thinking, it just wasn't there.
What's fascinating is that this whole thing, it gives us a peek behind the curtain of the fashion industry. How do ideas go from sketches to actual clothes? Where are the moments where someone could say, hold on, this design might be a problem?
And whose job is it to make those calls? Is it just the designers, or is there a bigger system of, I don't know, accountability?
That's the key question.
Okay.
It seems like there needs to be more transparency and accountability in the whole design process.
And maybe a little more humility too, right? The fashion industry. It's all about making bold statements, but sometimes a little restraint. And sensitivity can go a long way.
You're absolutely right. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about social media. It was Liz Kennedy's Instagram post that really brought this whole thing to light and, fueled the public outrage.
That's a good point. Makes you wonder, would this even be a big deal without social media? Would people even know about it?
It's hard to say for sure, but social media definitely made it much bigger. And it helped hold Burberry accountable.
It's like social media has become this watchdog for when companies mess up ethically.
That's a good way to put it. It's definitely changed how brands operate and how they respond when the public criticizes them.
So we've got this big fashion house, a controversial design, a model who is brave enough to speak out, and the power of social media, driving the whole narrative.
And at the core of it all, a really important question. How do we make sure the creative expression doesn't come at the expense of ethical considerations and basic human decency?
That's a question that goes way beyond fashion, right? It challenges us to think about power, creative processes, and our responsibility to society, all these things that shape the world around us.
Yeah, it's a question we all got to think about no matter what we do for a living.
We've been talking a lot about like the design process and all that, but it's important to remember what this whole thing did to Liz Kennedy. To speak out against a huge brand like Burberry, that takes some serious guts.
It really does. There's risk involved, especially for someone just starting out. I'd be curious to know, did speaking up help her career or hurt it in the long run?
Yeah, me too. It makes you think about the position models are often in. They're supposed to, embody the brand's image, but they don't have much say in the stuff they're asked to represent.
It's that power dynamic we were talking about before, right? It's everywhere, not just in fashion.
Mm.
Speaking of which, do you remember what Burberry said when the Mental Health Foundation criticized them?
Yeah, they said they heard the foundation's concerns and that they'd be more careful going forward. I think they even mentioned making some internal changes to promote diversity and mental well-being.
Right. And that's where this whole idea of corporate social responsibility comes in, right? Brands are being held accountable not just for their products, but for their values too, and how they impact society.
It's not enough to just make pretty clothes anymore. People want to know that the brands they buy from are ethical, sustainable, actually care about the world. They're voting with their dollars.
And that's a huge shift. It's forcing companies to rethink how they do things and to really prioritize stuff like diversity and inclusion, not just as a marketing ploy, but as something they actually believe in.
Yeah, speaking of diversity, I'm curious about the creative teams at these fashion houses. It's one thing to have diverse models on the runway, but what about the people who are actually coming up with the designs?
That's a great point. Real diversity has to go deeper than just the surface. It has to be part of the decision-making, part of the brand's DNA.
Because ultimately, it's those diverse viewpoints that can help prevent these kinds of messes. Different backgrounds, different life experiences, all of that. It brings a more nuanced understanding of what's appropriate and what's not.
Exactly. When you have the same kinds of people making all the decisions, it's easy to miss things. And sometimes those blind spots can have serious consequences, like we saw with Burberry.
Makes you think about how we can apply this to our own lives, even if we're not in fashion. Do we surround ourselves with people who challenge our thinking? Do we seek out different viewpoints?
Those are good questions. And it's not just about not offending people, it's about expanding our own understanding of the world. Different ways of thinking lead to better ideas, better solutions.
And more empathy, which is something we could all use a little more of.
This whole conversation has shown how everything's connected, right? We started with one hoodie, and now we're talking about power dynamics, mental health, corporate responsibility, and how diversity can make the world a more just and ethical place.
It's all woven together, isn't it? And it shows how something that seems superficial, like fashion, can actually spark these important conversations about deeper issues.
And that's the beauty of a deep dive, right? You start with one thing and end up exploring a whole network of connected ideas and perspectives.
Exactly. And we're not done yet. We haven't even talked about the economic side of things. Did this controversy actually hurt Burberry's sales or how people saw the brand?
That's a good question. Would be interesting to see if there was any real impact. Did people stop buying their stuff? Did it affect their stock price?
And what about the bigger picture? Did this incident have any ripple effects on the whole fashion industry? Did other brands learn from Burberry's mistake and change how they do things?
It's tough to say for sure, but it's possible that this whole thing was a wake-up call for the industry. Maybe it made them rethink their ethical standards and focus more on diversity and inclusion.
It's almost like a case study in how one event can start a much bigger conversation and maybe even lead to real change.
Exactly. And it shows how much power individuals have to hold these big companies accountable. Liz Kennedy choosing to speak out, even though it was risky, it sparked a dialogue that needed to happen.
It reminds us that even in a fancy industry like fashion, real change can start with one person, someone who's willing to speak truth to power.
And that's a powerful message for all of us, no matter what we do or where we are. We all have a part to play in making the world a more just and ethical place.
Speaking of platforms, let's go back to social media for a minute. It was huge in making this controversy what it was, but it also makes you think about how we consume and share information these days.
Absolutely. Social media can be great for holding brands accountable, but it can also spread misinformation and just create a lot of negativity. It's a double-edged sword.
So how do we deal with that? How do we know what to believe?
Right.
How do we use social media for good without getting sucked into all the bad stuff?
Those are questions we all have to wrestle with. It's about being smart about the information we consume, thinking critically about what we see and read, and being aware of how our own online behavior affects the world around us.
It's about being informed, engaged, and responsible, both online and offline.
Well said. And that brings up another interesting angle to this whole story, the legal and regulatory side of things. Are there laws about cultural appropriation and insensitive imagery?
That's a good question. I don't know of any specific laws, but there are definitely ethical codes and organizations that push for responsible design. But is that enough?
Maybe, maybe not. Some people think there should be more rules to stop brands from exploiting cultures or misrepresenting them just to make money. Others say creativity should be free, and it's up to consumers to decide what's okay and what's not.
It's a tricky issue with no easy answers, but it's a conversation we need to keep having.
Absolutely. It shows that brands, consumers, and policymakers need to keep talking and work together to make the fashion industry more just and equitable.
So we've talked about the creative process, power dynamics, social impact, legal stuff, and social media. It's amazing how one hoodie has taken us down so many different paths.
And we've only scratched the surface.
Yeah.
There's always more to discover, more perspectives to consider, more questions to ask.
Which is what makes a deep dive so interesting, right? It's a journey of discovery, a chance to learn and grow and question our assumptions.
And sometimes those journeys take us to unexpected places, showing us hidden truths and sparking new ideas. Who would have thought that a piece of clothing could lead to such a deep exploration of ethics, culture, and social responsibility?
It reminds us that even the most ordinary things can have deeper meanings and start important conversations.
And that's something to remember as we go through life, paying attention, questioning things, and always trying to understand more deeply.
Yeah, it's like we've, peeled back all the layers of this glamorous industry and found all these complex issues underneath.
Exactly. And it makes you think everything we wear, everything we buy, it has a whole story behind it, right? It's connected to people, to cultures, to, systems of power.
So as we're wrapping up this deep dive, what's the main takeaway for our listeners? What can we learn from what Burberry did wrong, and how can we apply that to our own lives?
I think it comes down to two things: awareness and action. Awareness of the impact our choices have, the messages we send, the systems we support. And action means speaking up, demanding better, making better choices ourselves.
It's realizing that we all have a part to play in creating a fairer and more just world, whether it's through brands we choose, the conversations we have, or the things we actually do.
And it's about being empathetic, being willing to listen to and learn from people who've had different experiences than us.
Because at the end of the day, it's by understanding and respecting those differences that we can create a world where things like that Burberry hoodie, they become something we learn from, not something that keeps happening over and over.
Here's a final thought for you to go on. Imagine you're the one in charge, okay? Maybe you're leading a team, designing something, or even just sharing your opinion online. How can you make sure that what you do matches up with your values, that you're being inclusive and sensitive, and that you're helping to make the world a better, more ethical place? Something to think about as we go forward, taking what we've learned from this deep dive with us.
Lots to think about, for sure. Thanks for joining us on this journey. Until next time, stay curious and keep those brains working.